The morning light pulls slow across 142 acres of Indiana ground. Corn stubble glints under May dew. A fence line cuts the property east to west, and along that fence line something is wrong. 40 feet deep, a quarter-mile long. Mountains of pale gray waste piled against the wire, where the best soybean ground in Marshall Township used to lie. A gravel lane runs north from the section road to a small white clapboard farmhouse. Wide front porch, south-facing window. A green Ford pickup rests in the driveway. A man stands at the end of that lane, 61 years old. Work boots stained dark, hands cracked at the knuckles paper in his fist. His jaw tightens. Once. Just once. On the porch steps, a 13-year-old girl watches him. She does not speak. 2 miles east, a black Lincoln Continental sits in the parking lot of a paper mill. Somewhere a phone is about to ring. On a Thursday in May of 1973, at the Wabash Rotary Club luncheon in north central Indiana, a man named Conrad Mallory cut a piece of pork roast and said 3 words about his neighbor that the whole table laughed at. Bless his heart. 4 years later, that neighbor would grow 57 bushels of soybeans per acre, on ground Conrad Mallory had personally destroyed. The Agricultural Extension Office at Purdue University would write a bulletin about it. 3 different state departments of agriculture would send men to Indiana to walk that ground and take samples of the dark, crumbling soil with their own hands. And Conrad Mallory would drive out to that fence line one Saturday in October of 1977, alone in a plain jacket with no clipboard and no tan blazer. And he would sit in his car for a long time looking at a field of harvested soybean stubble. And what he would carry into that field the next time he visited, it would not be a deed or a contract or an offer to buy. It would be a hospital record for an 8-year-old boy. But all of that came later. All of that came after the silence. All of that came after a quiet 61-year-old farmer named Hollis Beckman stood in his driveway in the spring of 1973 and read a letter that told him in the most polite language a paper mill could manage that 50 acres of the best ground in Wabash County. The ground his father had walked. The ground his father had buried his hat in when he died. The ground his wife had watched bloom every May for 37 years was not coming back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. It arrived in an envelope with the Westbrook Paper Mill logo printed in the upper left corner. A small embossed seal of a stylized tree being cut by a stylized axe, which Hollis Beckman had always found an honest piece of imagery even when the company that used it was not behaving honestly. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It was signed by Conrad Mallory, plant manager, Westbrook Paper Mill, Wabash, Indiana. It was in every meaningful sense a notice of war dressed in the costume of a courtesy. Dear Mr. Beckman, the letter began. Please be advised that Westbrook Paper Mill will continue its current practice of depositing surplus paper byproduct materials along the eastern boundary of your property, in accordance with the informal arrangement established in November of 1968. Hollis read the letter standing right there at the end of his gravel drive, still in his work boots. His hands cracked at the knuckles, dark under the nails, smelling of the earth he had been turning since before the sun came up. The morning dew was still on the grass beside him. His granddaughter Pearl, 13 years old that summer, was watching him from the porch steps. With the quiet attention she had developed in the 2 years since her grandmother Adeline had died, she watched his jaw tighten. Once, just once. Then she watched him fold the letter carefully along the existing crease and slide it into the breast pocket of his work shirt, the way a man might tuck away something he did not want to look at again until he had decided what to do with it. He did not crumple it. He did not curse. He did not look at her. He walked back into the house, poured himself a second cup of coffee from the percolator on the stove, and sat down at the kitchen table where his wife Adeline had served him breakfast for 37 years before the cancer took her. He drank that coffee slowly. He did not read the letter again. He did not need to. He already knew what it said. For 5 years, the Westbrook Paper Mill, 2 miles east on Route 13, had been dumping truckloads of paper sludge, the wet, pulpy residue left over from their bleaching and pressing operations right up against the eastern fence line of Hollis Beckman's farm. Mountains of it, pale gray when fresh, blackening with mold within 2 weeks of being dumped, smelling like a basement flooded with old laundry water. By the spring of 1973, those piles were 40 feet deep in places and stretched almost a quarter mile along the boundary of what had once been the finest ground in Marshall Township. The county would not stop it. The lawyers Hollis had consulted in Wabash and again over in Peru had explained with that particular combination of regret and professional detachment that lawyers learned to wear that the arrangement appeared on paper to be voluntary, that Hollis had accepted payment that the strip in question had been classified by the county as an agricultural buffer zone in 1968, and that the cost of litigation against a company with the legal resources of Westbrook Paper would likely exceed the value of the land in dispute. The lawyers were not wrong. That was the worst part. The lawyers were not wrong, and the county was not wrong, and the neighbors who shook their heads sympathetically at the feed store on Maple Street and said it was a real shame what was happening out there at Hollis Beckman's place were not wrong either. Everybody understood the situation. Everybody had arrived at the same conclusion. The fight was over before Hollis had ever figured out it had started. That was how good men lost things in 1973 in north-central Indiana. Not through violence, not through any single catastrophic event you could point to and name. They lost things the way Hollis Beckman had been losing the eastern 50 acres of his farm for 5 years. One truckload at a time. One polite letter at a time, one Rotary Club joke at a time, by 1,000 small invisible decisions made in conference rooms 2 hours away by men who would never set foot on the ground. They were ruining. Hollis Beckman was 61 years old that spring. He had been farming the same 142 acres outside Wabash, Indiana, since the day in 1949 when his father Wendell had pressed the deed into his hands at this same kitchen table and said, in the slow, careful voice of a man who chose his words, the way other men chose their boots, "This land has been Beckman ground for 90 years. You make it 90 more." Hollis had been 37 that day. His father had been 73 9 years from the heart attack that would take him in the front yard of the house Hollis still lived in. Hollis had kept the promise. He had kept it through the dry summer of 1953, when the corn came up stunted and yellow, and his neighbors started talking about selling. He had kept it through the flood of 1959, when the Wabash River jumped its low banks and swallowed his bottom field for 19 days straight. He had kept it through the commodity collapses of the early 60s, when men stronger and younger than him walked away from land their grandfathers had cleared by hand. Hollis stayed. He farmed the way Wendell had taught him, and the way Wendell's father, Cyrus, had taught Wendell, careful, patient, attentive to what the ground asked for, never extracting more than the ground was offering. He kept a team of Percheron horses, Otis and Marigold, long after every other farmer in the county had switched to diesel power. Not because he was stubborn, though. There were certainly men at the Wabash Co-op who thought he was. He kept them because he understood them. He understood what they took from the land and what they returned to it. A tractor compacts the soil, he would say quietly to anyone who asked, and the soil remembers. A horse gives a little something back with every step. The soil remembers that too. His equipment shed held a 1947 Farmall H, the red bonnet. Sun-bleached to almost orange, the magneto rebuilt twice. The carburetor adjusted every third week. The way a doctor adjusts a patient's medication. He used it for his heavier fieldwork. He could rebuild the entire engine blindfolded. And on a cold morning in February of 1966, he had nearly done exactly that when the spark plug wires had crossed in the dark of the barn, and he had traced the misfire by feel rather than by sight. His farmhouse was small and clean, white clapboard siding, a wide front porch where his wife Adeline had snapped beans every June for 34 years, a vegetable garden along the south wall that Adeline had tended until the diagnosis came in March of 1971. After her funeral in September of that year, Hollis had tended the garden himself every spring, putting in her same rows in the same order she had always planted them. Tomatoes along the south fence, green beans down the middle, summer squash in the corner where the morning light hit first. Neighbors noticed. Nobody said anything about it. It was not the kind of thing you said anything about. In the town of Wabash, Indiana, Hollis Beckman was known as a straight dealer and a quiet man. At the coop on Maple Street, where farmers gathered Saturday mornings over burnt coffee and the grain market report from the Indianapolis radio station, Hollis was respected the way an old fence post is respected. Not glamorous, not new, but solid and exactly where it was supposed to be. He had grown record yields of soybeans on his eastern 50 acres in 1964, and again in 1967. His neighbor Whitman Crowder, who farmed 280 acres directly across the section road, had once offered him cash money for just that parcel alone. Hollis had thanked Whitman and declined, and the two men had gone on being friends. By the spring of 1973, you could not farm a single row of that eastern 50. The paper sludge had seen to that. The man responsible for the sludge had never once driven down Hollis Beckman's lane to look him in the eye. The dumping had started quietly. That was how things like this always started. In November of 1968, on a gray Wednesday afternoon, while Hollis was working his north field cutting late hay before the first frost, a Westbrook Paper Mill truck had pulled up to the eastern fence line. By the time Hollis walked over to see what the noise was, the driver, a young kid, Hollis did not recognize and would never see again, had already tilted the bed and dropped a mound of fresh sludge. Pale gray, smelling sharply of the bleach chemicals the mill used in its pulp processing right up against the wire. The kid had handed Hollis a folded slip of paper. He had said the mill was paying $3 a month for the use of the strip. $3? Hollis had not agreed to anything. He had never signed a paper. But the kid was already climbing back into the cab of the truck. By the time Hollis had unfolded the slip and read it, the truck was rolling away in a cloud of dust on the gravel road. It was not a contract. It was not really anything. It was a notice carefully worded by someone in the mill's legal department who knew exactly what they were doing, and it sat in Hollis Beckman's hand that afternoon like a small piece of paper that weighed more than it should have. He called the mill from the payphone outside Renner's Diner on Route 13 the next morning. He was told Mr. Mallory was unavailable. He called again the following week. Mr. Mallory was in a meeting in Chicago. He drove to the mill office in December and sat in a plastic chair in the reception area for 45 minutes. before a secretary in a polyester blouse told him politely but firmly that the arrangement had already been reviewed by the county and was perfectly within regulation. Given that the strip of land in question fell within an agricultural buffer zone as classified by the Wabash County Planning Office in October of 1968. Buffer zone. Hollis had farmed that strip for 34 years. By 1970, the trucks were coming twice a week. The sludge piles had grown from knee-high to shoulder-high. In wet weather, they turned dark and matted, growing a fine gray mold on the surface that smelled like a wet cellar in August. In dry weather, the dried sludge particles blew fine white dust across his rows of soybeans, coating the leaves and clogging the air filter on the Farmall H so badly that Hollis had to wash and reinstall it twice a week, instead of once a month. By 1972, the eastern 50 acres were effectively lost. The acidic runoff from the sludge piles had drained downhill into his soil. His yields on that ground had dropped from 72 bushels per acre in 1967 to 41 in 1970 to 19 in 1972. By the spring of 1973, even the weeds were growing pale and stunted in the rows closest to the fence line. And then, in March of 1973, 3 weeks before the letter arrived in Hollis Beckman's mailbox, Conrad Mallory himself drove down the lane in a black Lincoln Continental with mill plates. Conrad Mallory was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, 6 feet tall, with the kind of haircut a man gets when he flies to Chicago every other month for corporate meetings. He wore a tan sport coat over a pressed white shirt on a Tuesday morning, the way a man dresses when he needs people to know he does not work with his hands. He had a clipboard. He had a firm handshake. He had the smooth, measured voice of a man who has delivered bad news many times before and has gotten good at it. He told Hollis the mill was expanding operations. The sludge volume would be increasing significantly over the next 18 months as Westbrook brought new bleaching equipment online. He was there, he said, as a courtesy to give Hollis advance notice. He used that phrase twice. As a courtesy. "We are going to need that whole fence line, Mr. Beckman," Conrad said, "right up to the tree row. I have already spoken with county zoning and we are well within our rights." Hollis looked at him steadily. "That is my best ground back there," Hollis said. Conrad Mallory glanced toward the eastern field. He let his eyes rest there for maybe 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Hollis with an expression that was in its own way worse than anger. It was indifference. The flat, efficient indifference of a man who has already moved on to his next appointment in his head. "It was your best ground," Conrad said. He said it gently. The way you tell a child that something is simply over now. The way you close a door behind you when you are leaving a room you do not intend to return to. He clicked his pen. He made a note on his clipboard. He got back in the Lincoln Continental and drove down Hollis Beckman's gravel lane and never once looked in the rearview mirror. That was 3 weeks before the letter arrived. That was the context in which a 61-year-old widower stood at the end of his driveway on a Tuesday morning in May of 1973 and read 3 paragraphs of polite corporate language confirming the destruction of 50 acres of Beckman ground. That was why his jaw tightened just once, and then did not move again for the rest of the morning. That was why he sat at his kitchen table after Pearl had gone back outside and drank his second cup of coffee, and stared at the south-facing window that Adeline had always kept so clean. He did not cry. Hollis Beckman was not a man who cried. But he sat at that table for a long time without moving. And when he finally stood up around 10:30 in the morning, the coffee in his cup had gone cold and his back hurt, the way it always hurt after he sat too long. And he had made a decision. He had not made it consciously. He had made it the way a farmer makes most of his decisions, by sitting with a problem until the answer settled down, through the noise of it like sediment settling through water. The decision was not yet a plan. The decision did not yet have a method. The decision was only this: he was not going to fight Conrad Mallory in court. He was not going to put a sign in his yard. He was not going to call the county again. He was going to do something else. He did not know what yet, but he knew it would not look like fighting because he was 61 years old, and he had buried his wife, and he had no son willing to come back to the farm. And he had a 13-year-old granddaughter sitting on his porch steps, who had been quietly studying him for 2 years now. To understand how a man was supposed to keep going when the people who mattered most kept leaving. He did not have it in him to fight the way he might have fought at 30. He did not have it in him to lose either. He had something else. He had time. He had ground. He had 42 piles of paper sludge stretching along his eastern fence line, weighing thousands of tons that he had not chosen to receive, but that had been given to him whether he wanted them or not. He stood at the kitchen sink and rinsed out his coffee cup. He set it in the drying rack. He walked outside into the May morning and crossed the yard to the equipment shed and pulled open the heavy wooden door. The Farmall H was waiting in the dim light exactly where it had been since Saturday afternoon. Hollis Beckman looked at it for a long moment. Then he climbed up into the cab and turned the key, and the old 2-cylinder engine knocked once, twice, and caught with the steady rhythmic beat the old-timers in Wabash County called Poppin' Johnny, and he backed it slowly out of the shed into the May sunlight. He drove it down the lane to the eastern fence line. He hooked up his single bottom plow, and he started moving material. His neighbor, Whitman Crowder, saw him from across the section road around 8:30 that morning and walked over, coffee thermos in hand, watching with the careful squint of a man trying to make sense of something that did not quite add up. Whitman was 63 years old. He had farmed his 280 acres for almost as long as Hollis had farmed the Beckman place. The two of them had grown up 2 miles apart. They had played on the same high school basketball team in Wabash in 1928. They had stood up at each other's weddings. They had buried each other's parents. They had not always agreed about politics or commodity strategies or how late to plant corn. But they had been friends for 45 years. And a friendship that lasts 45 years between two farmers in Indiana is its own kind of marriage. Hollis Whitman said slowly, 8 feet away from the tractor now, thermos still in his right hand. "What in the world are you doing?" "Working," Hollis said. "Working," Whitman repeated. He looked at the mountain of gray-brown paper sludge rising 40 feet into the May sky. He looked at the old red Farmall H knocking quietly in front of it. He looked at Hollis Beckman's face, which offered nothing further. "You're going to move all of it." "Not move it," Hollis said. "Turn it." Whitman stood there a moment longer, thermos halfway to his lips, the morning sun catching the side of his face and showing every one of the 63 years he had been carrying it. Then he shook his head slowly, not unkindly, but with the deep, weary resignation of a man watching his oldest friend do something he is fairly certain is not going to work. "Hollis," he said quietly, "that is paper sludge. You cannot farm paper sludge." Hollis Beckman put the Farmall H into gear. "Not yet," he said, and he drove forward into the first pile. Whitman Crowder stood at the fence line for another full minute watching him, the plow biting into the sludge, the pile slowly giving way. The dark, wet underlayer turning up into the sunlight for the first time in 5 years. Then Whitman walked back across the section road to his own farm. And that was that. By the second week of April, word had gotten around Wabash County, the way word always gets around small Indiana towns, not through any one conversation, but through the slow accumulation of small observations passed between people at the coop, at Renner's Diner, at the grain elevator over in Lagro. Old Hollis Beckman was out there working the paper sludge piles with that farmall, hour after hour, 6 days a week. Some of them said he was composting it. Others said he had finally gone soft after Adeline passed and was just keeping busy. A few of the younger farmers' men in their 30s, driving newer tractors and carrying newer debts, drove slowly past on Route 13 just to look. Some of them laughed. Not cruel laughter. The easy, careless laughter of men who are certain they understand something that another man does not. Conrad Mallory heard about it the way he heard about most things in Wabash County at the Rotary Club lunch on a Thursday in late April, from a county zoning officer named Roland Pickering, who thought it was a funny story and told it with the comic timing of a man who had been getting a laugh with the same kind of story for 20 years. Conrad listened. He cut a piece of pork roast on his plate. He smiled. "He is composting it," Conrad said with the bemused tone of a man identifying a mildly amusing species of bird. "I had an uncle who composted. Lovely hobby." He took a bite. Of course, my uncle did not try to do it across 50 acres with a 26-year-old tractor. The table laughed. Conrad Mallory let the laughter settle. He was in his way a careful man at moments like this. He understood the rhythm of a Rotary Club joke the way a violinist understands the rhythm of a phrase. He waited until the laughter had drifted into the slightly embarrassed silence that follows. The moment when a table of grown men has laughed at something they probably should not have laughed at. And then he added the next line, still pleasantly still, in that smooth, unhurried voice he used for board meetings and Chamber of Commerce mixers. "Paper sludge takes nitrogen right out of the soil when it breaks down. Every extension agent at Purdue will tell you that. The man is making his ground worse, not better. But I suppose when you have lost something, you have to feel like you are doing something about it." He picked up his water glass. Bless his heart, there were 23 men at that table. 22 of them laughed. Some of them laughed quietly. Some of them laughed loudly. One of them, a younger banker named Holden Frye from Wabash National, who had been a member of the Rotary Club for less than a year, did not laugh at all. Holden Frye looked down at his plate. Conrad Mallory noticed. He always noticed, but Conrad let it pass, because a Rotary Club is not a place where you call attention to a man who does not laugh at your joke. A Rotary Club is a place where you take the laugh you got and you move on to the next agenda item. And Conrad Mallory moved on, and the lunch eventually ended, and the men got up and shook hands and went back to their offices and their factories and their banks, and most of them forgot the joke by Friday morning. Holden Frye did not forget it. Holden Frye went back to his desk at Wabash National Bank that Thursday afternoon and sat for a long time looking out his second-floor window at the grain elevator across Main Street. He did not write anything down. He did not call anyone. But sometime in the late afternoon around 4:30, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a small leather notebook that he kept for personal observations. he did not want anyone else to see, and he wrote one line in pencil in his careful handwriting. "Bless his heart," Conrad said. "About the only farmer in this county who has never asked us for a loan." Then he closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in mid-May, Holden Frye would do something with that notebook that would change the way the rest of this story unfolded. But that came later. Back on the Beckman farm, Hollis did not hear about the Rotary Club joke, not directly. He may have caught traces of it through Whitman, through the slight stiffening of certain conversations at the coop on Maple Street, through the way young Roland Pickering looked at the ground, rather than at Hollis's face, when they happened to pass each other outside the courthouse one Tuesday afternoon. If he heard it, he gave no sign. He worked 6 days a week, sun up to past noon, then again in the late afternoon when the May heat broke. On the night of May 23rd, 1973, 2 days before Calvin's letter would arrive, Hollis Beckman went upstairs to clean out the closet of the small bedroom Adeline had used for her sewing. He had been putting the work off for 20 months. The cancer had taken her in September of 1971, and he had not opened that closet door since the morning of the funeral, when he had pulled down the dark blue dress she would be buried in and laid it across the bed, and walked out and closed the door behind him. The May evening was warm. The light through the upstairs window came in long and yellow. Hollis stood in the closet doorway with his hat in his hand for almost a full minute before he reached up and pulled the chain on the bare bulb. Adeline's sewing things were exactly where she had left them. Her thimble in a small porcelain dish on the top shelf. Her shears in a leather case her brother had given her in 1959. Her pattern books in a neat stack. Her cedar chest, the one her grandmother had brought from Kentucky in 1898, sitting against the back wall, under a folded gray blanket Hollis had thrown over it the morning after the funeral. He pulled the blanket off. He had not opened the cedar chest in 22 years. The last time he had opened it had been in the spring of 1951, when Calvin had been 16 years old, and Hollis had been looking for the leather work gloves Wendell had given him on his 21st birthday, and could not find anywhere else in the house. He had pulled the gloves out, found them too small for his older hands by then, and put them back in the chest with a sad, small understanding that hands change as men get older. Tonight, he opened the chest for a different reason. Tonight, he opened it because somewhere in the back of his mind, in the past 3 weeks since he had started turning the paper sludge piles, something had been nagging at him. A half memory, a piece of paper. Something his father Wendell had said one Sunday afternoon in 1948, the year before Wendell had handed over the deed, when Hollis had been 36 years old, and Wendell had been 72. They had been sitting on the front porch of this same house. Wendell had said in that slow, careful voice he used when he was telling Hollis something he wanted Hollis to remember, "Son, when men start throwing things away, sometimes that is when a farmer needs to start paying attention." Hollis had not understood what his father meant at the time. He had nodded politely. Wendell had not explained further. But now, 25 years later, on a May evening in 1973, with paper sludge piles 40 feet deep along the eastern fence line of his farm, Hollis Beckman was kneeling on the wooden floor of the upstairs bedroom, looking through the contents of a cedar chest he had not opened in 22 years. And he was looking for something specific, even though he could not have told anyone what it was. He found it in a folder near the bottom. The folder was thin. The cardstock was yellowed at the edges. The handwritten label on the tab read, in his father's slow, careful printing, USDA, October, 1947. Hollis pulled the folder out. He sat down on the wooden floor with his back against Adeline's small sewing chair. He opened the folder. Inside was a bulletin, United States Department of Agriculture. Bulletin number 847, dated October 1947. The title across the top read, Composting of Wood Pulp Byproducts for Soil Amendment in Indiana Agriculture. The primary author listed in small, careful type beneath the title was Wendell Beckman. Hollis Beckman sat on the floor of his dead wife's sewing room and read the bulletin under the yellow light of the bare bulb for the next 40 minutes. He read it slowly. He read every paragraph twice. He read the carbon to nitrogen ratios. He read the temperature protocols. He read the field test results his father had compiled across 4 years of experiments. In 1943, 1944, 1945, and 1946, using sawdust waste from a small lumber mill in Lagro Township that Hollis had no memory of his father ever working with. His father had written a USDA Bulletin. His father had spent 4 years composting industrial wood waste on the back 40 of this same farm before Hollis had ever started running the operations and had figured out the basic principles of what Hollis Beckman, 61 years old, was now trying to figure out on his own, 26 years later. Hollis sat with the bulletin in his hands. He thought about Wendell standing on the front porch in 1948 saying, "Son, when men start throwing things away sometimes, that is when a farmer needs to start paying attention." He thought about himself, 36 years old that day, nodding politely without understanding. He thought about how much of what a father says to a son does not land in the place the father intends until 20 or 30 or 40 years later, when the son finally understands the question the father was answering before the son had even thought to ask it. He put the bulletin carefully back in the folder. He stood up slowly on his bad left knee. He carried the folder downstairs to the kitchen table and set it in the center of the wood where Adeline had served him 37 years of breakfasts and dinners. And he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the May evening and the eastern fence line in the distance where 42 piles of paper sludge were waiting for the work of the next 3 years of his life. He spoke to Adeline aloud quietly just once. "Old man knew," he said. "He knew before I did." The kitchen was quiet around him. Tomorrow he would call the agriculture building at Purdue. Tomorrow he would ask the secretary at the front desk whether there was anyone left in the department who might remember a Wabash County farmer named Wendell Beckman who had written a USDA Bulletin in October of 1947 about composting industrial wood waste. But tonight, on this May evening, Hollis Beckman stood at his kitchen window with his dead father's bulletin on the table behind him and looked at the eastern fence line in the dying yellow light. And he understood for the first time that he was not as he had thought for the past 5 weeks working alone. His granddaughter Pearl, 13 years old in town, living with her father Calvin and her mother Loretta in Indianapolis during the school year, would come stay with Hollis on the farm every summer. From the day school let out until the day before Labor Day, she had been doing this every summer since she was 7, and she would continue doing it every summer for the rest of her grandfather's life. In the summer of 1973, she arrived on a Greyhound bus from Indianapolis on the 3rd of June, and her grandfather picked her up at the bus station in Wabash in the old green Ford F-100 pickup with the cracked passenger window sealed with electrical tape. She rode home with him in the cab without saying much. That was their way. Pearl had learned in the 2 years since her grandmother Adeline had died that her grandfather was not a man who needed conversation to feel a person beside him. He needed presence. He needed quiet. He needed the small, unspoken communication of a 13-year-old girl sitting in a pickup truck cab looking at the same Indiana cornfields he was looking at, and not feeling the need to fill the silence between them. On the second morning after she arrived, Pearl walked out to the eastern fence line around 9 in the morning with a jar of cold water and a biscuit wrapped in a clean dish towel. She stood at the edge of the fence line and watched her grandfather working the first pile. The old Farmall H knocking its slow rhythmic beat, the sun catching the dust raised by the plow. The smell of turned sludge, sharp and unfamiliar, mixed with the cleaner smell of disturbed earth underneath. Hollis saw her. He drove the tractor over to where she stood and shut the engine down. The June morning fell quiet around them. She handed him the jar of water. He drank half of it in one long swallow. Grandpa Pearl said. Hollis waited. "Are people saying bad things about what you are doing?" Hollis looked at her. 13 years old. Same brown eyes Adeline had been buried with. Same way of holding a question quietly until you answered it. "Probably," he said. "Does it bother you?" Hollis looked out across the rows of turned material, dark and steaming faintly in the morning cool. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in his plain, unhurried voice, the voice that Pearl Beckman would carry with her for the next 36 years of her life, and would teach to her own children one day in a different state, under a different roof. "Pearl, the ground does not care what anybody says about it. It just does what it does. I figure I ought to be the same way." He handed her back the empty jar. He started the tractor. He went back to work. Pearl stood at the fence line watching him. This thin, steady old man on his knocking smoke trailing Farmall H. The paper sludge stretching as far as she could see in both directions. The sky above him pale blue, almost white with the early summer haze. And something settled in her chest that she would not have words for until she was much older. It was the particular feeling of watching someone refuse to be small, even when the whole world is doing its level best to make them feel that way. She walked back to the house with the empty water jar, and she set it on the kitchen counter, and she went upstairs to the small bedroom that had been her father Calvin's when he was a boy, and she sat on the bed, and she opened the spiral notebook she had brought from Indianapolis, and she wrote down what her grandfather had said to her. "The ground does not care what anybody says about it. It just does what it does. I figure I ought to be the same way." She underlined it twice. Then she went back downstairs to help him. The letter from Calvin Beckman arrived on the morning of Friday, May 25th, 1973, in a long white business envelope with the return address printed in raised black letters that read, "Beckman and Associates Certified Public Accountants, North Meridian Street, Indianapolis, Indiana." Hollis pulled it out of the mailbox at the end of the lane around 8 in the morning. Pearl had not yet arrived for the summer. He was working the eastern fence line alone that week, turning pile number 7 for the first time the first warm week of May, running into June ahead of her bus, arriving the following Sunday. He saw the envelope in the mailbox before he saw the return address. He recognized the handwriting on the front of it. Calvin had inherited his mother Adeline's careful, slanted script. The kind of handwriting that looks like it belongs on a wedding invitation, rather than a Friday morning piece of correspondence. Hollis stood at the end of the lane with the envelope in his hand for a long moment. Then he walked back to the tractor, set the envelope on the toolbox welded to the rear fender, and went on working. He did not open it until that evening. He read it at the kitchen table after he had eaten his supper alone. The lamp over the table threw a soft yellow circle of light onto the wood, and the letter sat in the center of that light. 2 pages of his son's careful handwriting on Beckman and Associates letterhead, and Hollis read it twice all the way through slowly. The way he read every important thing in his life before he set it down and went to the cupboard above the sink and poured himself a small glass of bourbon. The bourbon had been Adeline's father's, a bottle of Old Forester from 1962. That had been a wedding gift from her brother in Kentucky, and Hollis had been pouring himself a single glass from that bottle exactly once a year on the night of Adeline's birthday in October, since she had died. This was not October. He poured the glass anyway. The letter was respectful. The letter was loving. The letter was in the calm, professional voice of a 38-year-old accountant who had spent the last 12 years building a successful firm in Indianapolis and had become accustomed to writing difficult letters to clients about their financial circumstances, also a kind of execution notice. Calvin had written that he had been worrying about his father for some time. He had written that since Adeline's death in September of 1971, he had observed through his summer visits and his quarterly phone calls and the reports of various neighbors he had spoken with that his father had become increasingly isolated, increasingly inflexible, increasingly resistant to what Calvin called the realities of modern agricultural economics. He had written that the situation with the Westbrook Paper Mill had finally crystallized his concerns. He had written that he had retained a Wabash County attorney named Edmund Trask to draft a voluntary transfer of farm management agreement, which Calvin would not be filing in court at this time, but which he was sending now as a proposal. His father might consider signing voluntarily over the next 90 days. Calvin had written that he wanted his father to know that this was not a hostile action. He had written that he loved him. He had written that he hoped his father would understand that there were better ways to spend the years he had left than turning paper sludge with a 26-year-old tractor in a fight that had already been lost. The agreement itself was attached. 8 pages. Hollis read each one. Under the terms of the proposed transfer, Hollis would retain ownership of the farmhouse and the surrounding 2 acres for his lifetime. The remaining 140 acres, including the eastern 50, Calvin had already mentally written off, would be deeded to a limited partnership controlled by Calvin. The farm operations would be leased to a custom farming operation out of Marion that already worked 1,200 acres in Wabash County. Hollis would receive a quarterly distribution from the partnership that Calvin's draft estimated conservatively at $2,800 per year for the rest of his life. It was a reasonable arrangement. Calvin's draft was reasonable. The numbers were reasonable. Hollis Beckman sat at his kitchen table with a glass of bourbon at his elbow and read his son's reasonable proposal twice more slowly. And when he was finished, he understood 3 things. The first thing he understood was that Calvin loved him. The second thing he understood was that Calvin had already decided this was going to happen. The third thing he understood was that he was now fighting on 2 fronts. Conrad Mallory on the east, his own son on the south, 2 hours down US 31 in Indianapolis. And he was 61 years old, and he had a bad knee, and a USDA Bulletin upstairs written by his dead father, and there was nobody else. He folded the letter back along its original creases. He put it in the drawer of the kitchen table where Adeline had kept her recipe cards. He drank the bourbon in 3 slow swallows and went to bed. He did not sleep. Around 2:30 in the morning, he got up and went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table again with a glass of well water. The house was quiet around him. The cuckoo clock Adeline had bought in 1958 ticked steadily on the wall above the bread box. Outside, the May night was cool and dark, and the only sound was the occasional low call of a barn owl down by the creek. He did not pray. Hollis Beckman was not a man who prayed in the way some men prayed, but he sat in the dark kitchen with his hands flat on the table where Adeline had served him 37 years of breakfasts and dinners, and he spoke aloud quietly just once in a voice meant only for the empty kitchen and the woman who was not there to hear it. "Adeline," he said, "am I being foolish?" The cuckoo clock ticked. The barn owl called again. Hollis Beckman sat in his kitchen until the first gray light came up over the eastern field, and the rooster started in the chicken coop, and then he got up and put on his work boots and walked out to the equipment shed, because there was a tractor that needed starting and 42 piles that needed turning. And a man does not stop being a farmer just because his son has sent him a voluntary transfer of farm management agreement. He did not tell Pearl about the letter when she arrived the following Sunday. He worked. That was what he had always done. 3 days later, on a Wednesday morning, Hollis drove the Ford F-100 pickup into Wabash to do his weekly errands. He stopped at the coop for fuel. He stopped at the hardware store on Wabash Street for half-inch galvanized pipe couplings to repair a section of the water line he ran out to the cattle troughs. And he stopped at Wabash National Bank to deposit a check from the grain elevator for the last of his 1972 corn that had finally sold at the end of April. Holden Frye was the bank president. Holden Frye was 41 years old, the youngest president in the history of Wabash National, the son of an Allen County farmer who had lost everything in the early 60s and had warned his son every Sunday at dinner for 10 years before the heart attack took him that there was nothing more important in life than knowing when other men were trying to take what was not theirs. Holden Frye saw Hollis Beckman come through the front door of the bank that Wednesday morning, and he stood up from his desk in the open office behind the teller windows, and he walked out across the lobby in his pressed gray suit and his polished Oxford shoes, and he intercepted Hollis just as Hollis was filling out the deposit slip at the standing counter. "Mr. Beckman," Holden said. Hollis looked up. He did not know Holden Frye well. He had met him once at the funeral of Holden's father in 1969 when Hollis had driven over to Fort Wayne because Holden's father had been a member of the Beckman Township threshing crew in the late 30s, and Hollis owed the family a respectful presence at the service. They had shaken hands briefly that morning. They had not spoken since. "Mr. Beckman," Holden said, "do you have 10 minutes?" Hollis considered him, the deposit slip in his hand. The May morning sun coming through the front windows of the bank lobby. He did. They walked back to Holden Frye's office. Holden closed the door. He gestured Hollis to a leather chair across from the desk. He did not sit behind the desk. He sat in the other chair beside Hollis. The two of them turned slightly toward each other, the way men sit when they are about to speak about something that does not belong in a formal business arrangement. "Mr. Beckman," Holden said, "I owe you an apology." Hollis waited. A month ago, Holden said at the Rotary Club lunch, a man named Conrad Mallory told a joke about you in front of 22 other men. I did not laugh at the joke. But I did not stand up either. I should have stood up. I've been sitting at my desk for a month now, thinking about why I did not stand up. And the answer I keep coming to is that I was afraid of Conrad Mallory. and what he could do to a young banker who did not yet have his footing in this county. Holden paused. "I am no longer afraid of Conrad Mallory," he said, "and I am no longer interested in sitting at my desk thinking about something I should have done. So I came to find you today. I wanted you to know that I heard what was said about you, and that I do not believe what was said about you, and that if there is ever anything you need from this bank, that the bank can lawfully provide you are to come directly to me, not the loan officer, not the teller window, directly to me." Hollis Beckman sat in the leather chair across from Holden Frye and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said in his quiet, plain voice, "Holden, I do not borrow money." "I know," Holden said. "That is the part I admire most." Hollis looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, "There is one thing, actually." Holden waited. "I need a notary," Hollis said. "And I need someone who can hold an envelope for me until the time comes to send it." Holden Frye reached across his desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. He took out a clean white business envelope and a sheet of bank letterhead. He set them on the desk in front of Hollis. "Tell me what you need," Holden said. Hollis Beckman sat at Holden Frye's desk for the next 40 minutes and wrote in his slow, careful farmer's hand a letter to his son Calvin. The letter was 3 pages long. It was the longest piece of personal correspondence Hollis Beckman had written in 20 years. He did not show it to Holden. He folded it into thirds when he was finished, and he sealed it in the envelope, and he wrote Calvin's name and Indianapolis address on the front. Then he opened a small paper bag he had brought with him from the truck. Inside the bag was a fistful of dark, crumbly material wrapped in wax paper. It was compost, not finished compost. The piles on the eastern fence line were not yet finished. They would not be finished for another 2.5 years. But this was a sample from the center of pile number 1 taken 3 days ago, where the temperature had moderated to a steady warmth, and the color had begun to shift from pale gray to the first hints of dark brown. It was not yet soil. It was not yet anything anyone would have called valuable. But it was in Hollis Beckman's mind evidence of a beginning. He opened the envelope. He slipped the wax paper packet inside. He resealed the envelope with a piece of bank tape Holden handed him. "Hold this for 90 days, Hollis said. "If I have not asked for it back by August 25th, mail it." Holden Frye took the envelope. He wrote a date on the front in pencil. He put it in his lock-and desk drawer. "I will mail it on August 26th if I have not heard from you by then," Holden said. Hollis stood up. He shook Holden Frye's hand. He walked out of Wabash National Bank into the May morning sunlight, and he drove home to the farm in the old green Ford F-100. And he did not tell anyone what he had done. That same afternoon, 220 miles southwest of the Beckman farm, in a small upstairs office on the agronomy floor of the Purdue University Agriculture Building in West Lafayette, Indiana, a 52-year-old retired professor named Marlin Vance was sitting at a metal filing cabinet going through a box of old correspondence. He was not supposed to be in his office. He had retired the previous September. The department had asked him to clean out the last of his files by the end of the spring semester, and he had been putting it off the way men put off the small, painful work of closing chapters in their lives that have run longer than chapters are supposed to run. He came across a folder he had not opened in 24 years. It was thin. The cardstock was yellowed. The handwritten label on the tab read, simply Beckman W., 1947 to 1949. He paused. He sat down in the wooden chair beside the filing cabinet. He opened the folder. Inside was the same USDA Bulletin Hollis Beckman had found in his father's cedar chest 2 weeks earlier. Bulletin number 847. Composting of wood pulp byproducts for soil amendment in Indiana agriculture. Author Wendell Beckman. Marlin Vance stared at the front page of the bulletin for a long time. He had been 26 years old when Wendell Beckman had walked into his office in 1947. Wendell had been a working farmer from Wabash County, 71 years old at the time with grease under his fingernails, and a stack of handwritten notes about a composting experiment he had been running on his own farm, using sawdust from a local sawmill. Wendell had not had a college degree. Wendell had not had a research budget. Wendell had not had anything except the notes he had made himself across 4 years of careful trial and error, and a deep instinct for soil that had been in his family for 3 generations. And Marlin Vance, 26 years old, brand new in the department, eager to publish, had taken those notes and written them up as a USDA bulletin under the proper academic protocols. Wendell Beckman was listed as primary author. Marlin Vance was listed as editorial collaborator. The bulletin had been published in October of 1947 and had been distributed to 1,200 county extension offices across the Midwest. It had also quietly saved Marlin Vance's academic career, because 2 years later, in the spring of 1949, Marlin Vance had been caught up in a small academic scandal involving a graduate student's dissertation that had relied on falsified soil samples. Marlin had been the student's advisor. The university had been preparing to dismiss him, and Wendell Beckman, asked to write a letter on Marlin's behalf, had written 4 pages in his slow, careful hand, explaining that the man who had helped him publish a bulletin about composting was a man of integrity who had been deceived by a student, not a man who had deceived anyone himself. That letter had reached the university president's desk in May of 1949. Marlin Vance had kept his job. He had gone on to a 30-year career at Purdue. He had married, raised 3 children, written 6 more bulletins, retired the previous September, with a small ceremony and a brass plaque he kept in his garage. He had never properly thanked Wendell Beckman. By the time Marlin had thought to drive down to Wabash County in 1958 to find Wendell and tell him in person what that letter had meant. Wendell Beckman had been dead for 3 weeks. Marlin had stood at the grave in the small cemetery north of Wabash, and he had not said anything because there was nothing to say. Now, on a Wednesday afternoon in late May of 1973, 24 years after Wendell Beckman had written that letter, and 15 years after Wendell Beckman had died, Marlin Vance was sitting in an office at Purdue, holding a yellowed bulletin and thinking about a debt he had never repaid. He put the bulletin carefully back in the folder. He put the folder into the cardboard box he had been packing for his car. The phone in his office rang the next afternoon at 3:15. It was the department's secretary. She told Marlin that a man named Hollis Beckman had called the front desk that morning. The man had said he was Wendell Beckman's son. The man had said he was driving up from Wabash on Saturday morning to bring a bulletin he had found in his father's papers and to ask whether anyone at the agriculture building might remember what his father had been working on. Marlin Vance hung up the phone. He sat at his desk in his small upstairs office for nearly 10 minutes without moving. Then he picked up the phone again, called the secretary back, and told her to ask Hollis Beckman to come to his office Saturday morning. He would drive into campus. He would meet him there. On the morning of Saturday, June 2nd, 1973, Hollis Beckman drove the green Ford F-100 pickup from Wabash to West Lafayette, 220 miles southwest, with the 1947 Bulletin in a manila folder on the bench seat beside him. He had told no one where he was going except Whitman Crowder, who had agreed to come over twice during the day to feed the chickens and check on Otis and Marigold in the barn. He had left a note for Pearl on the kitchen table letting her know he would be home by supper time. Pearl had arrived on the Greyhound bus the previous Sunday. She had not asked where her grandfather was going that Saturday. She had simply nodded when he told her he had business at Purdue. The drive took 4.5 hours. Hollis pulled into the visitor parking lot of the agriculture building at 11:30 in the morning. He sat in the truck for a minute with both hands on the steering wheel. Then he picked up the folder. He walked into the building. He found the front desk on the agronomy floor. The secretary recognized him without his having to say his name. She led him down a hallway to a small upstairs office where Marlin Vance was waiting in a wooden chair beside a metal filing cabinet. A yellowed folder open on his desk that contained the same bulletin Hollis was carrying. The two men looked at each other. Marlin Vance was 52 years old, slight build, wire-rimmed glasses, hair gone gray at the temples. He had been waiting for 9 minutes. Hollis was 61, 6 feet tall, work shirt buttoned at the wrists, a felt hat in his left hand. "Mr. Beckman," Marlin said. He stood up. "Mr. Vance," Hollis said. "I knew your father," Marlin said. "He came in here in 1947. I owed him something I never paid." Hollis nodded once. Marlin gestured to the chair across from the desk. The two men sat down across from each other in that small office for the next 3.5 hours. The bulletin lay between them on the desk. Marlin told Hollis about the letter Wendell had written in 1949 that had saved his career. Hollis told Marlin about the paper sludge piles on the eastern fence line, about Conrad Mallory, about Calvin's transfer agreement, about Pearl writing in her spiral notebook upstairs. Marlin pulled out a hand-drawn diagram of carbon to nitrogen ratios Wendell had given him in 1947 and walked Hollis through it line by line. Hollis pulled a folded sheet of his own paper from his breast pocket where he had been tracking pile temperatures since the 3rd week of April and showed Marlin what he had been measuring. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Marlin Vance stood up from the desk and walked to a bookshelf along the wall and pulled down 6 books and a stack of agricultural journals. He set them in 2 paper grocery bags. He handed them to Hollis. "These will get you started," Marlin said. "I will drive down to Wabash County the last weekend of July. I will stay 3 days. We will walk the fence line together." Hollis stood up. He took the bags. "I would appreciate that," he said. Marlin Vance looked at him. "I have owed your father something for 24 years, he said. "I never had a way to repay him. Maybe this is the way." Hollis nodded slowly. "Maybe it is," he said. He walked out of the office. He walked down the hallway. He carried the 2 paper grocery bags of books and journals down to the green Ford F-100 in the visitor parking lot and set them carefully on the passenger seat. He drove the 4.5 hours back to Wabash. He pulled into the gravel lane of the farm at 7:40 in the evening, just as the June sun was going down behind the equipment shed. Pearl was waiting on the porch steps. She had supper warm in the oven. She did not ask where the books had come from. She helped him carry them inside and stack them on the kitchen table. and she watched her grandfather, 61 years old, sit down at his place and open the first one and begin to read. 3 nights later, on the second morning, Pearl was on the farm for the new summer, June 5th, around 11 in the morning, while Hollis was working pile number 19 and Pearl was making cucumber sandwiches in the kitchen for the noon meal. A 1971 Buick Riviera with Indianapolis plates pulled into the gravel lane, and a man got out who Pearl had not seen since Christmas. Her father, Calvin Beckman. He was 38 years old, 6 feet tall, with the same brown eyes Pearl had inherited from his side of the family and the same careful, slanted handwriting his mother Adeline had taught him at the kitchen table when he was 9. He was wearing a navy blue sport coat over a white button-down shirt. He was carrying a leather attaché case. He had driven up from Indianapolis at 5 in the morning that day to talk to his father alone before Hollis had received the formal response from Edmund Trask about the voluntary transfer agreement. Calvin walked through the kitchen door without knocking. He had grown up in this house. He did not need to knock. Pearl turned from the counter where she was slicing cucumbers. "Hi, Daddy," she said. "Hi, sweetheart," Calvin said. He set his attache case on the kitchen table. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said, "Where's your grandfather?" "Out back," Pearl said. "East fence line, pile 19. Calvin closed his eyes briefly. He walked back out the kitchen door and across the yard and down the long lane toward the eastern fence line, and Pearl Beckman stood at the kitchen window with a cucumber half sliced on the cutting board and watched her father walk away from her, toward the figure of her grandfather, working alone on the old red tractor, with the smoke trailing up from the exhaust stack into the June sky, and something cold and sharp moved through her chest that she did not yet have words for. She would have words for it later. She did not yet. She finished slicing the cucumber. She made the sandwiches. She set them out on the kitchen table on the blue and white plates Adeline had brought from Kentucky when she got married. She poured 2 glasses of buttermilk. She set Hollis's at his usual place. She set Calvin's at the place that had been his when he was a boy. Then she sat down at her own place, and she waited. Out on the eastern fence line, Calvin Beckman stood for almost 3 minutes before Hollis turned the tractor and saw him. The old Farmall H knocked steadily in the June heat. Hollis shut the engine down. The silence rushed in like water filling a low spot. The 2 men looked at each other across 40 feet of paper sludge and turned compost. The father, 61 years old, with his work shirt soaked through and his hat pulled low against the sun. The son, 38, in his Indianapolis sport coat, with his polished shoes already covered in fine gray dust. Hollis climbed down from the tractor. He walked toward his son. He stopped about 10 feet away and waited. Dad, Calvin said. Calvin, Hollis said. "I got your letter," Calvin said. "I figured you did," Hollis said. There was a long silence between them. The wind moved through the corn stubble of the north field. A red-tailed hawk circled high over the tree line east of the sludge piles. Calvin reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat. He pulled out an envelope. Hollis recognized it. It was the envelope Hollis had sealed at Holden Frye's desk in Wabash National Bank on the Wednesday morning in May. It still had Holden's pencil notation on the front. August 25th. It had not been mailed. Calvin had received it 3 days ago. "Holden Frye," Calvin said quietly, "sent this to me on Friday. He sent it certified mail to my office. He included a note. The note said he had been instructed to hold this until August. He said he had decided he could not hold it that long." Hollis nodded once slowly. "I read your letter," Calvin said. "3 times. I read your letter sitting in my office at 5 in the afternoon on Friday with the door closed. And I read it again at home that night. And I read it a 3rd time on Saturday morning at the kitchen table while Loretta was making coffee." Hollis waited. "I read the part where you said you understood. I love you," Calvin said. "I read the part where you said you understood the agreement was fair. I read the part about the ground." His voice caught slightly. He looked away across the field. "I read the part where you said your father wrote a USDA Bulletin in 1947 about exactly what you were trying to do here." Calvin reached back into the inside pocket of his sport coat. He pulled out a second item. It was the small waxed paper packet of compost sample that Hollis had sealed inside the envelope. Calvin held it up between them. "Dad," he said, "I have been an accountant for 12 years. I have watched a lot of farmers in this state lose their farms because they would not change with the times. I have watched them sign agreements like the one I sent you 6 months too late after the bank had already started foreclosure. I have watched grown men cry in my office. I have watched their wives stop coming with them to meetings because they could not stand it anymore." He paused. "I sent you that agreement because I did not want to watch you become one of those men." Hollis nodded again slowly. Then Calvin Beckman, 38 years old, said the next sentence very carefully, the way a son says a sentence he has been working on for 3 days and does not want to get wrong. "But Dad," he said, "I have never seen a farmer turn his own ruined ground into a USDA Bulletin before. I have never seen a farmer at 61 years old start something that is going to take 3 years to finish knowing he might not be the one to harvest it. And I have never seen my own father write me a 3-page letter in his own handwriting, which is the longest letter you have ever written me in your life." Calvin's voice broke slightly. He cleared his throat. "I am withdrawing the agreement," he said. "I am writing to Edmund Trask this afternoon. Whatever happens here on this farm, you are the one who is going to decide what happens. I will tell you something else. I'm going to drive back to Indianapolis tonight, but I am going to come back here every other weekend for the rest of this summer, and I'm going to help you turn these piles. Not because I think you cannot do it without me, because I want to be the kind of son who shows up." Hollis Beckman, 61 years old, with grease permanently in the cuticles of his hands, and a bad left knee, and a wife buried 20 months ago, in the small cemetery north of Wabash, stood on a strip of churned earth between his eastern field and his ruined fence line. And he looked at his 38-year-old son, who had driven up at 5 in the morning from Indianapolis in a sport coat to say something he could have said in a letter. And Hollis did not say anything for a long moment. He just nodded once. Then he said in his plain voice, in the voice Pearl would write down later that afternoon in her spiral notebook, "Upstairs, Calvin, your grandfather would have liked to see you driving up here at 5 in the morning." Calvin nodded. He looked away across the field again. The red-tailed hawk turned in its slow gyre overhead. Father and son walked back to the house together, and Pearl Beckman watched them come up the long lane through the kitchen window, 2 men in the June sun, one in a soaked work shirt and one in a navy blue sport coat. Dusted gray at the cuffs and the cold, sharp thing in her chest, from 40 minutes earlier, turned warm and settled, and she pulled 3 sandwiches out of the bread box instead of 2, and she added a 3rd plate to the table. That was June 5th, 1973. 11 days later, on Saturday morning, June 16th, The second fire of that summer happened at the Westbrook Paper Mill. The first fire had been small, May 21st. A bleaching tank had overflowed, and a hot machine part had ignited some discarded packing material. The Wabash Volunteer Fire Department had contained it within 40 minutes. The county newspaper had run a brief notice on page 4. The second fire was not small. It started in the same area as the first, but this time the bleaching chemicals had pooled in a deeper section of the floor, and by the time the night watchman had spotted the orange glow at 3:12 in the morning, the blaze had reached the storage area, where the mill kept its dry pulp waste, before the trucks hauled it out to the Beckman fence line on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. The fire burned for 9 hours. 2 firefighters were treated for smoke inhalation. No one died. But by mid-morning on June 16th, the Westbrook Paper Mill had lost its entire dry waste storage building, its eastern processing line, and what the Indianapolis Star would later estimate as $4.2 million in equipment and material. The mill was not going to be hauling sludge anywhere for the rest of June. It was not going to be hauling sludge anywhere for the rest of July. The County Environmental Quality Office, which had been quietly working on a sludge containment complaint filed by a Lagro Township farmer named Earl Vinton back in February, suddenly had a much more pressing interest in the mill's waste handling practices. By Monday morning, June 18th, 3 more farmers had filed formal complaints. By Wednesday, the Environmental Quality Office had requested a meeting with Westbrook Paper Mill management. By Friday, the Indianapolis Star had run a front-page story under the headline, "Wabash Mill Faces State Scrutiny After Fire," and Conrad Mallory had spent 4 hours in a closed conference room with his corporate vice president from Chicago, being asked to explain very precisely how a single bad week in mid-June had turned a routine paper mill into a $4 million liability with potential pending environmental litigation from 3 local farmers and a state regulatory review. The vice president had come down on a Learjet from Chicago. He had stayed for 2 days. Before he left, he had told Conrad Mallory 3 things. The first thing he told him was that the mill had been in his family, the Mallory family, for 3 generations, and the corporate parent in Chicago was not going to allow that history to become an obstacle to financial discipline. The second thing he told him was that the mill had 90 days to demonstrate a fundamental change in its waste handling practices, or the corporate office would begin the process of closing the Wabash facility and consolidating operations at the Marion plant. The third thing he told him was that Conrad Mallory's own employment with Westbrook Paper Mill was contingent on the success of that 90-day demonstration. Conrad Mallory drove home from the mill office on Friday, June 22nd at 6:40 in the evening. He did not go to the Rotary Club lunch the following Thursday. He did not go to the Rotary Club lunch the Thursday after that. He sat in his office at the mill from 6 in the morning until 8 at night for the next 3 weeks, going through engineering proposals from waste management consultants out of Indianapolis and Cincinnati and Chicago, none of which offered a solution he could implement in 90 days for less than $2 million, and most of which would require shutting down the eastern processing line he had just rebuilt. On the night of July 4th, 1973, while Wabash County was watching the Independence Day fireworks display over the courthouse lawn 3 miles to the south, Hollis Beckman was asleep in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse, and Pearl was asleep in the small room that had been her father's. And a small orange glow began to grow at the southern end of the eastern fence line in the rough middle of pile number 4. Pearl woke first. She had always been a light sleeper. The orange light through her bedroom window was wrong for July moonlight, and it was moving and it smelled like something burning. She got out of bed in her cotton nightgown and walked to the window and looked out, and saw the flames lifting 6 feet into the dark sky from the southern end of the fence line. She ran across the upstairs hall to her grandfather's door. "Grandpa," she said. "Grandpa." Hollis was awake by the second time she said his name. He was a farmer who had spent 61 years sleeping like a farmer, which meant always 1/4 awake. He pulled on his work pants and his boots without lacing them. He was out of the house in under a minute, and Pearl was right behind him with a flashlight and a metal bucket from the porch. They ran down the long lane in the July dark. The pile was already gone by the time they got to it. The dry top layer of paper sludge, baked all afternoon in the 90-degree heat, had taken the fire faster than anything Hollis had seen burn since the threshing fire of 1957. The wet inner layer was steaming but holding. The pile was burning from the outside in. Hollis ran to the cattle well 200 feet south and started filling buckets, and Pearl ran the buckets to the pile, and the two of them worked for 40 minutes in the dark, the August moon barely up the only other light, the orange of the dying fire, and the white circle of Pearl's flashlight. The pile was lost by the time the Wabash Volunteer Fire Department arrived at 2:15 in the morning. The fire chief was a man named Earl Stute, who had been chief for 19 years and had known Hollis Beckman his entire adult life. He stood with Hollis at the edge of the burned-out pile in the July night, with his flashlight pointed down at the ground and his face tight, in a way Hollis had not seen since the threshing fire of 1957. Hollis Earl said. This was set. Hollis looked at him. "Smell it," Earl said. "Whoever did this used gasoline. Maybe a gallon. Maybe 2. The accelerant pattern is along the south side. They came in from the section road. They were in and out in under 3 minutes." Hollis stood there in the July dark, with a soot-covered metal bucket in his hand, and the smell of gasoline in the air, and his 4th compost pile burned out in front of him, and he did not say anything. He nodded once, slowly. Earl Stout stood beside him for another minute. Then he said quietly, "I will file a report. We may not find who did it, but I will file the report." He shook Hollis's hand. He left. Hollis Beckman sat in the ash in the wet ground at the edge of pile number 4 for the next 3 hours. The pile was a long, dark hill of cooling cinder. The other 41 piles untouched sat in the moonlight along the fence line in their patient rows. Pearl had gone back to the house at 3:30 when Hollis told her to. She had not wanted to go. She had gone because he had asked her to. He sat with his back against the upturned root mass of a maple stump at the edge of the field, his work pants soaked through at the knees, his hands black with soot, and he looked at the ruined pile, and he did the thing he had not done in 20 months. He laughed once, a short, dry laugh, almost a cough. Then his shoulders shook, and he put his face in his soot-black hands, and he sat like that for nearly 2 minutes in the July dark. Pearl found him there at 6:15 in the morning when the first gray light came up over the eastern field and the rooster started in the chicken coop. She had not slept. She had gone back to the house at 3:30 because he had asked her to, but she had sat at the kitchen window the rest of the night, watching the southern end of the fence line and waiting for him to come back. When he did not come back by 6, she had walked down the lane with the second jar of cold water and the heel of yesterday's bread. She sat down beside him in the wet ground. She did not say anything. She handed him the bread and the water. He drank half of the jar. 6 months later, in early January of 1974, Whitman Crowder would drive over to the Beckman farm on a Saturday morning and sit at the kitchen table with Hollis over coffee and finally say what he had been holding for 6 months. He had been driving home from the courthouse on the night of July 4th, sometime around 11:30 before the fire. He had seen a Chevy step-side pickup with no plates parked along the section road 200 yards east of Hollis's fence line. The truck had been familiar. The truck had belonged to one of the night maintenance men at the Westbrook Mill, a man named Lyle Pratt, who had been laid off the previous month after the May 21st fire, and had been drinking heavily ever since at the tavern on Wabash Street. Whitman had not said anything that night. He had told himself he had been mistaken. When he heard about the 4th of July fire the next morning, he had not been able to tell himself he had been mistaken any longer. But by then, he said quietly to Hollis across the kitchen table, "By then, I did not have the proof. And I had a son working at that mill, and I was afraid to say what I knew. I should have said it. I am saying it now." Hollis Beckman looked at his oldest friend across the kitchen table. "You said it now," Hollis said. That was all he said. The two men drank their coffee in silence for almost 20 minutes. Then Whitman put on his coat and he walked out and he drove home. And from that day on, Whitman Crowder came over to the eastern fence line every Tuesday and Friday morning with a thermos of coffee and helped Hollis hand-turn the trickier sections of the inner piles, and he did this without being asked and without ever speaking of pile number 4 again. Out at the mill, Conrad Mallory heard about the 4th of July fire the next morning. He drove past the Beckman farm slowly on the section road that Friday afternoon. He saw the long blackened scar where pile number 4 had been. He did not stop. He drove on. On the evening of Wednesday, July 18th, Conrad Mallory drove home from the mill at 9:15 at night, and his wife, Janelle Mallory, met him at the front door of their colonial-style house on the west side of Wabash, with their 8-year-old son, Eli, in her arms. Eli's lips were tinged faintly blue. Eli was struggling to breathe. Eli had been struggling to breathe since 6 o'clock that evening, and Janelle had been on the phone with the pediatrician twice and had been told to take him to Wabash County Hospital if his color did not improve in the next 30 minutes. Conrad Mallory drove his wife and his son to the hospital. They admitted Eli for the second time that month. The attending physician, a pediatrician named Dr. Imogen Halstead, who had been treating Eli for severe asthma since he was 4 years old, told Conrad and Janelle in the soft, careful voice she used for parents she was about to deliver difficult information to that Eli's lung function had deteriorated significantly since his last visit, and that they needed to consider whether the air quality in his current environment was contributing to his condition. Conrad Mallory drove his Lincoln Continental home from Wabash County Hospital at 1:30 in the morning on Thursday, July 19th alone, while Janelle stayed at the hospital with Eli, and he sat in his driveway for 40 minutes with the engine running before he turned off the ignition and walked into his quiet, empty house and sat down at his kitchen table and put his head in his hands. He thought about Hollis Beckman. He had been thinking about Hollis Beckman off and on for almost 2 months now. He had thought about him after the May 21st fire, when one of the engineers from the Cincinnati consulting firm had mentioned in passing that some industrial waste streams responded well to biological remediation, the kind of slow composting that small organic farms had been experimenting with on the East Coast since the late 60s. He had thought about him after the June 16th fire, when the Indianapolis Star had quoted Earl Vinton from Lagro Township, saying his cattle would not drink the water in his pond anymore. He had thought about him the morning he had driven past the burned-out southern end of the Beckman fence line and seen the blackened scar where pile number 4 had been, and had wondered briefly whether one of his own men had done it. The story of the old farmer turning paper sludge into compost had been traveling through Wabash County for 2 months now. It was not the same story it had been in May. Whitman Crowder had stopped at the eastern fence line every Tuesday and Friday morning to bring Hollis a thermos of coffee. The young extension agent at the county office, a 28-year-old named Quentin Halsey, who had only had his job since March, had driven out to the Beckman farm on July 2nd with a clipboard and a soil sampling kit. The county newspaper had run a small piece on July 10th under the headline, "Local Farmer Composting Mill Waste Reports Early Progress." Holden Frye had paid for a second small piece to run on July 17th as a paid advertisement, framed as a letter to the editor in which Holden had written in his careful banker's prose that the farmers of Wabash County could learn something from the example of a quiet man on Route 13 who was trying to repair what other men had broken. Conrad Mallory had read all of these things. He had not commented on any of them. Now at 1:30 in the morning on Thursday, July 19th, with Eli's hospital bed, mental image in his head, and the dim possibility of his own family's 3-generation mill closing down in his hands, Conrad Mallory did something he had not done since he was 19 years old. He cried. He sat at his kitchen table and cried for almost 20 minutes quietly, the way men of his generation cried when they cried at all, with his face in his hands and his shoulders shaking only slightly. He did not call anyone. He did not pour himself a drink. He let it run through him until it was done. Then he stood up and washed his face at the kitchen sink and dried it with a dish towel and walked into his study and pulled an empty file folder out of his desk drawer. He labeled the folder in his careful, precise handwriting Beckman. He put 2 things in the folder that night. The first thing he put in was a copy of the soil report Quentin Halsey had filed with the county on July 8th, which Conrad had quietly obtained from a contact at the county office the following week. The report described the organic matter content of pile number 12 at Hollis Beckman's eastern fence line as approaching 3 times the county average. The microbial activity Halsey had written in his neat extension agent prose was exceptional for the region. The second thing he put in was a photocopy of an article Conrad had cut out of the Indianapolis Star 3 days earlier on July 16th, which had reported on a new EPA initiative that would, beginning in 1975, require all paper mills with sludge byproducts to demonstrate compliant disposal practices or face federal regulatory action. Conrad Mallory closed the file folder. He put it in the bottom drawer of his desk. He did not know yet what he was going to do with it. The folder sat in Conrad Mallory's desk drawer for 3 more months. Out on the Beckman farm, the July heat broke into August. The creek along Hollis Beckman's south property line dropped to a trickle. The piles dried faster than Hollis could water them with the F-100 and the stock tank. And there were 2 weeks at the end of July when Hollis got up at 4 in the morning to water the piles by lantern light before the sun came up, and the heat began to pull moisture out of them too fast for the biological activity to continue. On the night of August 4th, around 2 in the morning, Hollis Beckman sat down on the wooden bench by the cattle well at the south end of the barnyard, 200 feet from the easternmost compost pile, and he listened to the well pump cycle on and off for 40 minutes in the dark, while he tried to decide whether he had the strength left in his body to keep doing what he had committed to doing. Pearl found him there at 4:15 in the morning. She had heard the screen door of the kitchen open at 2, and she had stayed awake in her bed, waiting to hear it open again. When it did not, She got up and put on her sweater and her boots, and she walked out to the south barnyard with a flashlight. And she found her grandfather sitting on the bench by the well with his hands on his knees and his eyes closed. She sat down beside him. She did not say anything for a long time. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at her. "Pearl," he said, "the ground tells you what it needs. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." His voice was rough. He had not spoken for 2 hours. He looked at her for a moment longer. "My father told me that when I was 20 years old," he said. "He told me in this same barnyard. He told me by this same well. I'd forgotten he ever said it until tonight." Pearl reached over and took her grandfather's hand. It was the first time in her life she had ever done that. They sat together on the wooden bench by the cattle well in the August dark, the well pump cycling on and off behind them, and they did not say anything else until the first gray light came up over the eastern compost piles. Then Hollis Beckman stood up slowly on his bad left knee, and he walked back to the equipment shed, and he started the Farmall H, and he drove out to pile number 27, because there was work to do and the ground had told him what it needed, and he was still quiet enough even at 61 years old to hear it. The summer of 1973 turned into the fall of 1973, and the fall of 1973 turned into the winter, and the winter turned into the spring of 1974. And through all of it, Hollis Beckman kept working. He worked through October with his shirt sleeves rolled down against the cooler mornings. He worked through November with a wool jacket and leather gloves and a knit cap pulled over his ears. He worked through the first week of December until the ground froze solid and the piles stopped breathing, and he could not drive the half-inch galvanized pipe into the centers anymore without bending it. Then he stopped, and he spent the rest of December and all of January and most of February in the equipment shed, rebuilding the magneto on the Farmall H, repairing the homemade turning attachment he had welded together in April, and going through the box of correspondence Marlin Vance had sent him in the fall. The correspondence had begun in June. After their first meeting in the agriculture building at Purdue, Marlin, Vance had driven down to Wabash County on the last weekend of July with a station wagon full of books, soil testing equipment, and a hand-drawn diagram of the carbon to nitrogen ratios Wendell Beckman had been experimenting with in the late 40s. Marlin had stayed for 3 days. He had walked the eastern fence line with Hollis. He had sat at the kitchen table eating Pearl's tomato sandwiches and explaining in his careful, retired professor's voice the specific microbial processes that turn cellulose waste into stable humus. After that first weekend, Marlin had written to Hollis once every 2 weeks through the fall. Long letters in careful handwriting, soil sampling protocols, citations from agricultural journals, a photocopy of a 1962 study from Cornell on cellulose decomposition rates in cool climate compost systems. Hollis had read every letter. He had written back. Pearl had taken some of the letters back to Indianapolis with her at the end of August and had typed clean copies of them on her father Calvin's office typewriter and had mailed them to her grandfather in October, so he would have organized records. By February of 1974, Hollis Beckman had become, without knowing it, one of the better educated practitioners of industrial waste composting in the state of Indiana. He still farmed in his denim work shirt and his felt hat. He still drove the green Ford F-100 with the cracked passenger window sealed with electrical tape. He still got up at 4:30 every morning. He still drank his coffee black out of the same chip mug Adeline had used for the last 6 months of her life. But the work he was doing had changed. By the spring of 1974, When the ground thawed and Hollis went back to turning piles on the eastern fence line, he was no longer working from instinct and half-remembered lessons. He was working from a written protocol he had developed himself in his own hand, based on his father's 1947 bulletin, Marlin Vance's letters, and 12 months of direct observation of 41 compost piles through every weather condition Indiana could offer. He was in the careful, precise language Quentin Halsey would use in his official report. 2 years later, conducting one of the most thoroughly documented composting experiments ever undertaken by a private farmer in the state. He did not know that was what he was doing. He thought he was just working. Calvin Beckman drove up from Indianapolis every other weekend through the entire summer and fall of 1974, exactly as he had promised on June 5th of the previous year. He arrived Friday evenings in the navy blue sport coat changed into the work clothes Hollis kept for him in the upstairs bedroom that had been Calvin's as a boy, and worked alongside his father from Saturday morning through Sunday afternoon. Pearl, now 14, divided her summers between the farm and her parents' house in Indianapolis in a rhythm she had worked out herself. She came up the first week of June and stayed through the third week of August. She wrote in her spiral notebook every evening. She asked her grandfather questions, but only the questions that mattered and only one or two at a time, and she let the answers settle. Whitman Crowder came over every Tuesday and Friday morning with a thermos of coffee. Holden Frye drove out to the farm twice that summer on Saturdays in his bank president's sedan, and he walked the fence line with Hollis without saying much. He had paid for the second piece in the county newspaper. He had spoken 3 times at Rotary Club lunches about the importance of supporting independent farmers in Wabash County. He did not laugh anymore at jokes that were told at the expense of quiet men. He had become in his own careful way a different kind of banker than Wabash National had ever had before. Marlin Vance drove down from West Lafayette 4 times in 1974, twice in 1975, and 3 times in 1976. He brought a graduate student with him on the 3rd visit, a serious young man named Owen Halverson, who was working on a master's thesis about cellulose breakdown in agricultural waste streams. Owen took soil samples back to Purdue. Marlin paid for the lab analysis out of a small grant he still had access to through the Emeritus program. The results came back in January of 1976, and Marlin drove down personally to deliver them to Hollis at the kitchen table. The organic matter content of the eastern fence line compost, Marlin said, was 8.4%. The county average that year was 2.1%. Hollis Beckman did not say anything for a long moment. He looked down at the page Marlin had set in front of him. He read the numbers twice. He thought about his father Wendell standing in the barnyard in 1932 with a handful of decomposed leaves from the windbreak, explaining to a 20-year-old Hollis Beckman the basic principles of what a careful man could do with what other men threw away. Hollis looked up at Marlin. He nodded once. "That is a respectable number," he said. Marlin Vance, 55 years old. That January, retired agronomy professor from Purdue University who had written 6 USDA bulletins and supervised 43 master's theses over the course of his career, smiled at Hollis Beckman across the kitchen table and said in the voice of a man who had finally repaid a debt he had been carrying for 27 years, "That is a respectable number, Hollis." "Yes, it is." By the fall of 1976, all 41 remaining piles had finished. Pile number 4 had never been rebuilt. The blackened scar where it had been sat in the rows like a missing tooth, and Hollis had left it that way deliberately, because some losses he had decided a man does not paper over. Some piles had taken 8 months. The largest pile, number 27, had taken 19 months. Hollis had kept the small composition notebook through the entire process. By the time he closed it on October 14, 1976, after recording the final temperature reading on pile 39, the notebook had dirt on every page. The spine was held together with a brown rubber band Adeline had used for her recipe cards, and the back cover had Pearl's name written on it in pencil from a Sunday afternoon in 1974, when she had borrowed it briefly to make a list of butterfly species she had seen on the south property line. In late October, Hollis borrowed Whitman Crowder's broadcast spreader, and over the next 4 weeks, working 2 hours every morning before the ground froze, he incorporated the finished compost into the eastern 50 acres. He went over every section twice. He used the disc harrows on the Farmall H to work the material into the top 6 inches of soil. He let the field rest through the winter. He planted soybeans on May 10, 1977. The summer of 1977 was a good one in Indiana. Warm nights, regular rain, a long stretch of mild July weather that allowed the corn and soybean crops across the state to develop steady root systems. The Indiana corn yield that year would end up being the 3rd highest in state history. The soybean yield would be respectable but not spectacular. The county average for soybeans in Wabash County that fall would come in at 31 bushels per acre. But what was happening on Hollis Beckman's Eastern 50 was not simply the result of a good summer. By the last week of June, Whitman Crowder was standing at the fence line again. Same spot as 3.5 years earlier. No coffee thermos this time, just standing with his hands in his back pockets and his head tilted slightly to one side the way a man stands when he is trying to make sense of something he has been expecting to see for a long time and now cannot quite believe he is actually seeing. The soybean stand on the Eastern 50 was extraordinary. Not good, not promising. Extraordinary. The kind of stand that makes a farmer stop walking and just look for a minute because he needs to make sure he is seeing what he thinks he is seeing. Deep green, uniform, dense plants that had clearly found something rich and deep to root into. Where Whitman's own beans across the section road showed the slightly pale color of plants working hard. In ordinary ground, Hollis Beckman's Eastern 50 looked like a photograph from an agricultural college textbook. Whitman bent down and pulled a plant from near the fence row. He looked at the root system. It was extraordinary too. White, branching, threaded through soil that crumbled dark and loose between his fingers like potting mix. He stood at the fence line for a long time. When Hollis came around on the tractor that afternoon, Whitman flagged him down. "Hollis," he said. He stopped, started again. What did? He held up the root ball almost helplessly. Hollis looked at it, then he looked at Whitman. "Compost," Hollis said simply. Whitman Crowder nodded slowly. He looked back at the field. The soybean rows stretched away from the fence line in dark green corridors that did not show a single yellow leaf anywhere across the entire 50 acres. "I will be damned," Whitman said quietly. He was not laughing now. He was not shaking his head. He was just standing there, 67 years old, in his patched work overalls with the honest, uncomplicated expression of a man who had been Hollis Beckman's neighbor for 47 years and had finally been shown something true. Word traveled fast in Wabash County when the thing traveling was a 50-acre soybean field that looked like nothing anyone had seen in 20 years. By the second week of July, farmers were driving past on Route 13 the way they had driven past 3.5 years earlier, slowly looking. But the mood was different now. The windows came down. Men leaned out and looked for a long time before driving on. A few stopped at the end of the lane and walked up to knock on the screen door of the kitchen. Hollis showed them all the same thing. He walked them down to the field. He let them pull a plant if they wanted to. He answered their questions in his quiet, unhurried way. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not mention the years of early mornings and hauled water, and the night he had sat by the cattle well at 4 a.m, wondering if he had the strength left to keep going. He did not mention his son's voluntary transfer agreement, or the letter Holden Frye had refused to hold until August. He did not mention the joke at the Rotary Club. He did not mention pile number 4. He just showed them the soil, dark and crumbling and alive, and the soil said what needed to be said. In late July, Hollis sent a letter to Quentin Halsey at the county extension office. He had decided after thinking about it for 2 weeks that the time had come to have an official record made of what he had done. He did not want it for himself. He wanted it for Pearl and for any other young person in Wabash County who might come along later and need to know that what was possible on a piece of ground was not the same thing as what the experts said was possible. Quentin drove out on the morning of August 2nd. He spent 4 hours walking the field with Hollis. He took 36 soil samples in a careful grid pattern across the eastern 50. He measured plant height. He counted nodes. He examined root systems on 6 different plants. He filled an entire spiral notebook with field notes. The final yield estimate Quentin would file with the state 2 months later was 57 bushels per acre. The county average that fall would come in at 31. Then he drove back to the county office in Wabash, and he wrote up a preliminary report, and he sent it to the Indiana Department of Agriculture in Indianapolis. He sent a copy to Marlin Vance at Purdue. He sent a copy to the Agricultural Extension Office at Ohio State University because the dean there had been a graduate school classmate of his, and Quentin thought he would find it interesting. The Ohio State Extension Dean read the report on Friday, August 5th. He forwarded it on Monday, August 8th, to a soil scientist he knew at the United States Department of Agriculture, regional office in St. Louis. The St. Louis soil scientist read it on Wednesday, August 10th, and forwarded it to her supervisor in Washington. The supervisor in Washington, a 53-year-old woman named Dr. Marguerite Stenholm, who had been with the USDA for 27 years and had not been genuinely surprised by an agricultural report in over a decade, read it on Friday, August 12th, and immediately picked up her phone and called Quentin Halsey at the Wabash County Extension Office. She wanted to know if she could send a team out to the Beckman farm to take additional samples. Quentin Halsey, 32 years old, that summer said, "Yes, ma'am." He was certain that could be arranged, and he hung up the phone and sat at his desk for almost 2 minutes before he picked it back up and called the Beckman farm to tell Hollis that the United States Department of Agriculture was going to send people to Wabash County to look at his soybean field. Hollis took the call at the kitchen wall phone. Pearl was at the table beside him doing a chemistry workbook she had brought up from Indianapolis. Hollis listened to Quentin for almost a minute without saying anything. Then he said, "Well, Quentin, if they want to come look, they are welcome to come look." He hung up the phone. Pearl was watching him. "Grandpa," she said. Hollis sat down at the kitchen table across from her. "The federal government wants to look at the East 50, he said. Pearl set her pencil down. "Are you going to let them?" she said. Hollis thought for a moment. He looked out the south window. The August afternoon light was coming through the glass Adeline had always kept clean. "Pearl," he said, "the ground does not care who looks at it. It just does what it does. I figure I ought to be the same way." Pearl smiled. It was the same smile she had been carrying around since she was 13, and it had only gotten better. "I have heard that one before," she said. "I figured you had," Hollis said. Conrad Mallory drove out to the eastern fence line on Saturday morning, October 22nd, 1977. He came alone. He came in his Lincoln Continental, but he parked it at the end of the gravel lane instead of driving up to the house. He was wearing a plain brown jacket over a flannel shirt. He had not been on the Beckman farm property since the morning in March of 1973, when he had stood in this same lane and told Hollis Beckman that 50 acres of his best ground was no longer his best ground. That had been 4 years and 7 months ago. A great deal had happened to Conrad Mallory in those 4 years and 7 months. His son Eli was now 12 years old. Eli's asthma had stabilized in 1975 after Conrad and Janelle had moved him out of the colonial house on the west side of Wabash, which had been 3/4 of a mile downwind from the mill stacks, and into a smaller ranch house on 12 Mile Road north of town that was upwind of the prevailing weather. Eli could climb stairs now without getting winded. He played outside in 30-minute stretches. He slept through the night without the breathing treatments his mother had administered every 2 hours for the first 8 years of his life. The Westbrook Paper Mill had survived the 1973 fires, but it had not survived them the way Conrad had hoped. The corporate office in Chicago had not closed the Wabash facility. They had done something Conrad had not anticipated. They had sold it. In November of 1975, Westbrook Paper had divested the Wabash Mill to a smaller regional paper company out of Fort Wayne called Heartland Pulp and Paper. The new ownership had retained Conrad as plant manager, but at a reduced salary, and the new corporate office had been more interested in production targets than in long-term capital investment in waste management. By the summer of 1977, the mill was operating under a state-imposed compliance improvement plan that required, among other things, that the sludge byproduct stream be reduced by 40%. By January of 1979, or the mill would face a state-mandated production cut that would almost certainly require laying off 70 of the mill's 240 employees. Conrad Mallory had been working 60-hour weeks for 18 months, trying to figure out how to reduce a sludge stream that was a fundamental byproduct of the bleaching process the mill had been using for 47 years. He had not figured it out. He had spent $12,000 of the mill's consulting budget on engineering studies. He had toured 3 other paper mills in Ohio and Michigan that had implemented compliance plans. He had read 17 technical papers on cellulose waste management. He had sat in meetings with the Indiana Department of Environmental Quality regulators who had been polite and professional, and had also made very clear that the compliance timeline was not going to be extended. In late September, a clerk in the county extension office had brought Conrad Mallory a copy of the soil report Quentin Halsey had filed with the state in August about the Beckman farm. Conrad had read the report at his kitchen table on the evening of October 4th. He had read it 3 times. He had sat at his kitchen table afterward for almost an hour with the report face down beside his coffee cup, looking at the wall. 2.5 weeks later, on the morning of October 22nd, Conrad Mallory parked his Lincoln Continental at the end of Hollis Beckman's gravel lane and walked up toward the house carrying a manila folder under his arm. Pearl saw him coming first. She was sweeping the front porch with the broom Adeline had used for 30 years. She was 17 years old now, a senior at Park Tudor School in Indianapolis, applying to soil science programs at Purdue and Ohio State and the University of Wisconsin. She set the broom against the porch rail. She knew who Conrad Mallory was. She had known who he was since she was 13. She had never spoken to him. Pearl walked to the screen door of the kitchen and said in a calm voice that did not give anything away, "Grandpa, there is a man here." Hollis came out of the kitchen. He came to the front door. He saw Conrad Mallory standing in the gravel of the front yard with a manila folder under his arm. He looked at Conrad for a moment. Then he opened the screen door and walked out onto the porch. "Mr. Beckman," Conrad said. Mr. Mallory, Hollis said. "I wonder if I could have 10 minutes of your time," Conrad said. Hollis Beckman stood on the porch in his work boots and his denim shirt and looked at the man who had stood in this same yard 4 years and 7 months earlier and told him very gently that everything he had built on 50 acres was now over. He looked at Conrad for a long moment. He looked at the manila folder. He looked at the Lincoln Continental parked at the end of the lane instead of driving all the way up to the house. He looked at Pearl standing in the kitchen doorway with the broom in her hand. "You can have 10 minutes, Hollis said. "You can have it in the kitchen." He held the screen door open. Conrad Mallory walked up the porch steps and into the kitchen of the Beckman farmhouse for the first time in his life. Pearl set the broom against the wall and went upstairs without being told. She did not want to be in the room. She did not want to not be in the room either. She compromised by going halfway up the stairs and sitting on the 3rd step from the top where she could hear without being seen. In the kitchen, Hollis poured 2 cups of coffee from the percolator and set them on the kitchen table. He sat down at his place. He gestured Conrad to the place across from him, which had been Adeline's place for 37 years and had become Calvin's place on the weekends he came up from Indianapolis. Conrad Mallory set the manila folder on the table. "Mr. Beckman," he said. Hollis waited. Conrad opened the folder. He removed the top item. It was a hospital admission record, the small white cardstock that the county hospital used for documenting pediatric stays, with a date and a chart number and a name across the top. The name was Eli Mallory. The date was July 18th, 1973. There were 6 other admission records behind it, all in chronological order. The most recent one dated April of 1975. Conrad slid the stack across the table. "These," Conrad said, "are my son Eli's asthma admissions to Wabash County Hospital between 1971 and 1975. Hollis looked at the stack. He did not pick it up. There were 7 admissions in those 4 years, Conrad said. 2 of them were close. The pediatrician told us in the summer of 1975 that the mill's emissions were probably contributing to his condition. We moved out to 12 Mile Road in September of that year. He has been admitted twice since then. Not 7 times. Twice. He is 12 years old now. He plays baseball for the Wabash Junior League." Conrad paused. "Last week," Conrad said, "I read the report Quentin Halsey filed with the state in August about what you have done with this ground, about the soil report, about the microbial activity, about the organic matter content." He paused again. "Mr. Beckman, I have spent 18 months trying to figure out how to reduce the sludge stream coming out of the mill. I have spent $12,000 of company money on consultants and engineering studies. I have toured other mills. I have read every paper that has been written on this subject in the last 10 years. Nobody in any of those papers or any of those mills or any of those consulting firms has done what you have done here." Hollis looked at Conrad steadily. Conrad reached back into the folder and took out a second item. It was an old USDA Bulletin, yellowed at the edges, dated October of 1947. "Quentin Halsey gave me this last week," Conrad said. "He said you had a copy. He thought I should have one too. He said your father wrote it." Hollis looked at the bulletin. Conrad placed it carefully on the table between them. "Mr. Beckman," Conrad said, "I do not have the authority to offer you money. The mill is owned by Heartland Pulp and Paper now, and there is no budget for license fees and there is no budget for outside consulting. I do not have the authority to offer you anything from the company at all." He paused. He looked at Hollis. He looked at the hospital records on the table. "I came here this morning to ask you personally whether you would teach me what you did. Not as a consultant, not for money, just as one farmer to another. My family owned this mill for 3 generations before they sold it. My grandfather built it in 1911. I want to figure out how to save the 70 jobs that are going to disappear in January of 1979 if we do not get the sludge stream down. I want to figure out how to keep my own job long enough to get Eli through high school. And I do not know how to do any of that without learning what is in your head." Conrad Mallory was 48 years old that October morning. He had not asked another man for help in his entire adult life in the way he was asking now. Hollis Beckman looked at him across the kitchen table. He looked at the hospital records. He looked at the USDA Bulletin his father had written 30 years before. He looked out the south window where Adeline had always kept the glass so clean. Then he said in his plain, quiet voice, "Mr. Mallory, you can come back next Saturday morning at 7 o'clock. Bring a pair of work boots. Leave the Lincoln at the end of the lane." Conrad Mallory closed his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said. He picked up the hospital records and put them back in the folder. He left the USDA Bulletin on the table. He stood up. He shook Hollis Beckman's hand across the kitchen table for the first time in their lives. He walked out of the kitchen and across the front porch and down the gravel lane to the Lincoln. And he drove back to Wabash, and he did not tell anyone in his office on Monday morning what he had done. Upstairs on the 3rd step from the top, Pearl Beckman wrote in her spiral notebook in pencil, in the careful hand she had inherited from her grandmother Adeline, October 22, 1977. Conrad Mallory came to ask for help. Grandpa said yes. She underlined yes twice. Conrad Mallory came back on Saturday morning, October 29th at 7 o'clock in work boots and a flannel shirt and a heavy canvas jacket. He kept coming back. He came every Saturday morning for the next 14 months. He brought a notebook. He took notes. He walked the fence line. He learned how to read pile temperatures with a galvanized pipe. He learned what carbon to nitrogen ratios meant in practical terms. He learned how to identify a pile that had gone anaerobic and what to do about it. He learned slowly the patient mechanical knowledge that had taken Hollis Beckman 3 generations and 47 years to assemble. In March of 1979, the Westbrook Mill, now operating under the Heartland Pulp and Paper name, began composting its sludge byproduct on a 40-acre site Heartland purchased from a defunct dairy operation 2 miles north of the mill. The site was managed by Conrad Mallory. The protocols had been developed by Conrad in consultation with Hollis Beckman and Marlin Vance. The composted material was sold for $30 a yard to farmers across north-central Indiana. The 70 jobs at the mill were saved. Eli Mallory played baseball at Wabash High School. He graduated in 1983. He went to Indiana University. He became an environmental engineer. In 1979, the United States Department of Agriculture published Bulletin number 1247 titled Industrial Cellulose Waste. Composting for Agricultural Application, Indiana Field Study. The lead author was Dr. Marguerite Stenholm. The second author was Quentin Halsey. The third author was Hollis Beckman. The bulletin was dedicated in a single line on the title page to Wendell Beckman, author of USDA Bulletin, 847 October 1947. Marlin Vance died in 1986 at 65 years old of a stroke. He had retired a second time the year before, after coming back to Purdue part-time in 1976 to consult on the Beckman research. His widow, Susanna, donated his correspondence files to the Purdue archives. The Beckman folder was the largest in the collection. Calvin Beckman moved his accounting practice from Indianapolis to Wabash in 1985, at the age of 50. He bought a small office on Maple Street. He continued to drive out to the farm every weekend, but now it was a 50-minute drive instead of a 2-hour one. Pearl had earned her doctorate from Ohio State in soil science in 1987. She took a position with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. She was based in Beltsville, Maryland for most of her career, but she came home every summer. Whitman Crowder died in 1991 at 81. He was buried in the same cemetery north of Wabash, where Wendell Beckman had been buried in 1958. And where Adeline Beckman had been buried in 1971. Hollis attended the funeral. He did not speak. He stood by the grave with his hat in his hand for 10 minutes after everyone else had left. Conrad Mallory retired from Heartland Pulp and Paper in 1994 at 65. He continued to manage the composting site for 2 more years as a contractor. Eli got married in 1996. Conrad walked his son through the ceremony with no breathing difficulties at all. Hollis Beckman died on a Sunday morning in October of 1996 at 84 years old in his bed at the farmhouse with Pearl beside him. He had been sick for less than 2 weeks. He had finished the harvest the previous Friday. The Eastern 50 had produced 71 bushels of soybeans per acre. That year, the highest yield it had ever produced. Pearl was 36 years old at his death. She inherited the farm. She did not move back to Wabash County. She kept her position with the USDA. She leased the operating ground to Whitman Crowder's grandson, a man named Henry Crowder, who was 42 and farmed 300 acres of his own, and who promised Pearl in the kitchen of the farmhouse on the afternoon of Hollis's funeral that he would not change a single thing about the way the Eastern 50 was managed. He kept that promise. In May of 2009, Pearl Beckman, 49 years old, drove from Beltsville, Maryland to Wabash, Indiana on her annual spring visit to the farm. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. She let herself into the empty farmhouse with the key Calvin kept under the stone by the back porch. She walked through the kitchen where Henry Crowder's wife had left a vase of fresh tulips on the table and a note that said, "Welcome home, Pearl." She walked through the living room. She climbed the stairs to the small upstairs bedroom that had been her father's when he was a boy and hers every summer from age 7 to age 17. The spiral notebook she had started in June of 1973 was in the top drawer of the dresser. She had filled 6 notebooks in total, between 1973 and 1977. She had stopped writing in them after she left for college. They had been in the dresser drawer for the next 32 years, exactly where she had left them. Pearl pulled the first notebook out of the drawer. She sat down on the small bed she had slept in as a girl. She opened the notebook to the first page. The ground does not care what anybody says about it. It just does what it does. I figure I ought to be the same way. She had underlined it twice. She read through the notebook slowly. She read through her 13-year-old self watching her grandfather work the eastern fence line in the May of 1973. She read through the morning her father Calvin had walked back from the field with her grandfather, and Pearl had laid out a third plate at the kitchen table. She read through the August night Hollis had told her about her great-grandfather Wendell standing in the same barnyard 57 years before. She read through Conrad Mallory's October visit and Holden Frye's letter to the editor and Quentin Halsey walking the field with a notebook and a soil sampling kit. When she got to the last page of the first notebook, she closed it carefully. She set it back in the drawer with the other 5. Then she walked back downstairs and out into the May afternoon and across the yard and down the long lane to the eastern fence line. The compost piles were gone. They had been gone for 32 years. The eastern 50 was a soybean field. The corn would go in next spring. The rotation Henry Crowder followed was the same rotation Hollis Beckman had followed for the last 15 years of his life. The soil was dark. The soil was loose. The soil crumbled between Pearl's fingers when she bent down and picked up a handful. She stood at the fence line for a long time. The wind moved through the corn stubble of the north field. A red-tailed hawk turned in slow gyres over the tree line east of the property. Pearl thought about 3 generations of Beckman men who had asked the ground the same question. Wendell, who had written it down in a USDA Bulletin in 1947. Hollis, who had answered it with 41 compost piles in 4 years of his life when most men would have given up. The man who had laughed at them. The man who had stopped laughing. The man who had eventually driven up the lane in plain jackets with hospital records in manila folders. She thought about Conrad Mallory, retired now and living in Florida with his wife. She thought about Eli Mallory, the environmental engineer who sent Pearl a Christmas card every year. She thought about Calvin, who had died in 2004 at 69, after 20 years of running an accounting practice in the town his father had farmed in. She thought about Holden Frye, still alive, still in Wabash, 81 years old, still walking down to Maple Street every Saturday for coffee at the Coop. She thought about her grandfather lying in the small bed upstairs in October of 1996, looking at her saying his last words. "Pearl," he had said, "the ground will tell you. Just be quiet enough to hear it." Pearl Beckman, 49 years old, doctor of soil science, principal investigator on 3 USDA research grants, mother of 2 children of her own who were back in Maryland waiting for her to come home from her annual May visit, stood at the eastern fence line of her grandfather's farm in the May sunlight of 2009 and let the dark, crumbling soil run slowly through her fingers back to the ground. She did not say anything. The ground did not need her to say anything. The eastern 50 was still here. The soil had simply been waiting the way ground. Always waits for the people who are quiet enough to hear what it has been trying to tell them all along. Most men, her grandfather had once said, walk right over the answer to their problems every day. They just never looked down. Pearl Beckman looked down one more time. She brushed the last grains of soil from her fingers. She turned and walked back up the long lane toward the farmhouse where the supper Henry Crowder's wife had left on the stove was warming, and where the lamp in the kitchen window had been lit against the gathering May evening, and where she would sit at her grandfather's table and eat a meal and read the second of the 6 spiral notebooks before she fell asleep that night in the small upstairs bedroom that had been a father's and then a daughter's, and was now in the only way that mattered the place where 3 generations of Beckman ground had finally finished saying what they had spent 90 years trying to say.